Hi, and welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thanks for joining us today. If you enjoy this series, make sure you subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook to watch our latest interviews. And of course, visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our humanitarian and advocacy efforts across the globe. Well, if someone had told 19-year-old Marty Appel that he would spend nearly 50 years entwined with the greatest sports franchise in history, he would never have believed it. In 1968, Marty got a job as a mail clerk for the New York Yankees, his favorite team, assigned to spend the summer answering, among others, Mickey Mantle's fan mail. And from there, he became the team's youngest ever public relations director, its television producer, and eventually the Yankees' foremost historical authority, having authored the team's history, Pinstripe Empire, among his 24 books. Marty's upcoming book, Pinstripes by the Tail, half a century in and around Yankees baseball, is an intimate look at an iconic franchise through his eyes. We're fortunate to have Marty join us for a conversation about his new book, his incomparable collection of insider tales, the intersection of Judaism and baseball, and more. Marty Appel is an Emmy Award winner, two-time Casey Award winner for Best Baseball Book of the Year, and has been inducted into the New York State Baseball Hall of Fame. He's seen or heard regularly on the Yes Network, MLB Network, and Sirius XM Sports, was consulting producer for Billy Crystal's motion picture 61 on HBO, and the ESPN miniseries The Bronx is Burning, and is generally regarded as one of baseball's most informed historians. Marty, thanks for being here. Excited to talk Yankees baseball and more with you today.
Thank you. Great to be with you. And I'd like to dedicate the interview to my late mother, who was president of B'nai B'rith Women of Coconut Creek, Florida. So this
wow, that's a great honor and a great dedication. Well, we're talking today about more or less 10 or 12 games into this Major League Baseball season. But before we talk about anything else, let's start off with the most important question, which is, how did you become a Yankees fan? You're from Brooklyn, and there were three teams in New York in those days, and Brooklyn, that was your hometown team. So how did it happen that you became a fan of the Bronx Bombers?
It was an accident. I was 7 years old, and my very first baseball memory, or baseball experience actually, was the 1955 World Series, when the Dodgers finally won their first World Championship, beating the Yankees in 7 games. In my 7-year-old innocence, looking at everybody dancing on the streets in St. John's Place in Brooklyn, I felt terrible for the losers, for the underdogs. So my heart went to the Yankees, feeling, this is my team. They're going to come back next year. I know it. So I became a Yankees fan then in the 55 World Series. 56 is the first full season I remember as a fan. And sometimes I realized I knew more at age 12 than I do today, because you could follow it more closely. 16 teams, 400 players. So it was me and the Yankees starting in 1955. And fortunately for me, it worked out that way, because the Dodgers moved to Los Angeles in 58. My heart would have been broken, but I was spared.
Well, you liked the Yankees growing up. You became a real intense fan. But did you want to work for them? When did it occur to you that this might be a good idea? And how did you get started with the team?
Well, I thought I was going to go into journalism or maybe even law. But I was still a great fan, even in an era when baseball was not very cool and not a lot of people were focused on it in the late 60s. But after my freshman year in college, I just woke up one day and had an idea to write to the PR director of the Yankees, a gentleman named Bob Fischel, and ask for a summer job. Everybody in my dormitory was sort of going through some kind of process like that. So I wrote to the Yankees, not really expecting an answer. But I got invited down for an interview. And on the day I was invited down, the clubhouse man had wheeled in like 6 cartons of unanswered Mickey Mantle fan mail. So Bob Fischel knew these had to be answered because those would be very unhappy fans. And here I was, the only applicant looking for a summer job, because as I say, it wasn't something college kids were into then. Baseball was not really happening in the late 60s. So the interview went well, and I got hired for in the summer of '67 to answer Mickey's fan mail, which was a great experience because I had to spend quality time with Mick going over the mail one on one. He was one of my boyhood heroes. Bobby Richardson was actually my favorite player. But working with Mickey and then staying friends with him for the rest of his life was beyond wonderful.
Yeah, I also was pretty much the same in terms of Mantle, not as close. I also thought he was the greatest, and I played for a little league team. Actually, it was the Dodgers, but I wore number 7, and so I thought that was that kind of balanced it out a little bit. Let's talk about Mantle for a second. How did that friendship develop? So in the beginning, you were answering his fan mail, but did you have an opportunity to see him? I think '67 was 2 seasons before he actually retired. So there was a lot of time in between.
Well, the fan mail was generally uninteresting. Dear Mickey, you're my favorite player. Please send me an autographed baseball. That was kind of 99% of them. But somehow I'd always managed to find a few that I needed to go over with him in person. And he saw right through me. He knew I was just looking for Mickey time. So he was amused by that. And although we were very different as people, he took a liking to me. Sometimes I would drive home at night and think, Mickey Mantle knows my name. Who could believe this? But after he retired, he became a spring training instructor for us. I would be in Fort Lauderdale every spring as doing PR for the Yankees. And I'd pick him up at the airport. We'd go and have lunch. We'd pick up his rental car. And we'd really have nice conversations about things other than baseball. So a bond was developed there, and I was thrilled to be able to keep in touch with him the rest of his life.
Let's talk about your new book, Pinstripes by the Tail, half a century in and around Yankees baseball. You've done so many other books. There it is. What inspired you to write it and publish it now?
I thought I was done with books after my Casey Stengel biography in 2017. I had no more ideas until my agent suggested that I'm a pretty good storyteller, and why don't I put all my anecdotes and tales into a book? Now, when I was a kid, I used to love books that had a lot of short stories followed by white space, another page and a half anecdote, white space. Those sort of got me to be a reader. And that's what I tried to capture in this. When I first talked to my editor, I said, now these stories aren't going to connect. I know you're going to say to me, they need a thread to go from one to the other. And I'm going to tell you, they don't. It's like picture 6 guys sitting around having lunch, telling baseball stories. Nobody cares whether they connect or not. And that's what this book is. Just a procession of some 200 stories I like to tell friends. And it only took me 4 weeks to write because I didn't have to do any interviewing. I didn't have to do any research. Didn't have to hit my book collection back here. It was just the stories I tell. And everybody seems to think it came out quite nicely. It actually comes out May 2nd and can be pre-ordered on Amazon.
Well, we'll remind our viewers of that at the end of the program. Let's talk about the Steinbrenner era. The Yankees are up for sale. I think it was it $10 million? Was that the sale price?
Yeah.
Think about that in terms of where we are today. So he purchased the Yankees from CBS in 1973. So you really know the Yankees pre and post Steinbrenner. If you would, compare and contrast the eras.
Well, the CBS era, which preceded the purchase by Mr. Steinbrenner and his group, was a very dismal time for Yankee baseball and Yankee fans. The team had grown old. They weren't replacing their players with quality players. Baseball had created this free agent draft for amateur players in which you had to select in order. You couldn't just pick the best players out there because you were the Yankees. So things had fallen onto hard times. And when George Steinbrenner and his group bought the team in January of 73, 50 years ago, we saw new life being pumped into the franchise. This was a guy, he wanted to buy the Yankees for its glamour, and he bought not just the current team, but he bought the whole history. That's what you have when you own a team. But we saw this will to win, this drive to get better and better. And we saw it even in the first year when he authorized purchases of some starting pitchers that was going to elevate the club. We didn't win until 76, but beginning immediately in 73, we saw a whole new attitude going on. And those of us who worked there were fans as well. And we wanted success because we rooted for the team. We were rooting for our employer, but we were still kids at heart and still baseball fans. So his entry changed everything. The Yankees became a contender year after year. There were some gaps there where they didn't do well, but always you felt he was putting money back into the team and doing his best to get the best players.
Was the hiring of Billy Martin a few times, was that also connected not just to having a good manager in the dugout, but also part of continuing that Yankee tradition of the 50s? Was that really connected to his thinking?
Absolutely. As I said, he was buying the whole history of the team. So he took great pride in sort of owning the legacies. Mantle, DiMaggio, Berra, Ford, and Billy Martin was one of the great Yankees in the 50s. He was a player who far exceeded his abilities just by putting on that uniform. And he proved that when he went to other teams, and he was quite ordinary. But he wore that Yankee uniform, and he'd rise to the occasion. And Mr. Steinbrenner saw that as the kind of leader he wanted in the Yankee dugout. So Bill Verdon was fired to make room for Billy Martin, and we all liked Verdon a lot, and he had been manager of the year before. But as soon as Billy became available, we felt like, uh-oh, this is inevitable. This is going to happen.
Just another question about Steinbrenner before we move on, and if I could kind of compare and contrast here to eras, to the current era. Clearly, Steinbrenner is referenced today always when an owner or general manager goes out to get the best possible player to improve a team at any cost. Do you think that Steinbrenner would do what some of the teams have done in recent years, which is win a championship or win a pennant and then have a fire sale and then rebuild? Would that have interested him, or was he, do you think, always in it just to win the prize, to win the World Series?
Well, he had loyalty to the players that delivered for him. When the Yankees won in 2009, the last time they were in the World Series, the Yankees spent a lot of money to keep a lot of players who might otherwise have moved on because there was a loyalty there for the guys that got us there. So I think absolutely he would have remained loyal to the ones who had delivered a world championship. But he was pragmatic. He would do whatever it took to win. But if it meant letting somebody go, like when he went and got David Wells in the 90s, Wells came through, and then he had a chance to trade him for Roger Clemens, and he did. He was less involved with the roster changes at that point as he was advancing in years. And Brian Cashman and Gene Michael were more involved. But still, the philosophy of George Steinbrenner carries through to this day.
Well, it's hard to believe, but this is the 50th anniversary of the designated hitter, Ron Blomberg, becoming the first designated hitter in Major League Baseball history. Blomberg is also Jewish, and proudly so. You wrote the foreword to his book, The Designated Hebrew. Talk about how the two of you formed such a close friendship.
We first became friends. My first spring training and his first spring training was in 1970. And we just sort of found ourselves drawn to each other. I'm not sure I would say it was because we were both Jewish, but maybe that played a factor in the background. But we'd go to dinner often. Our wives would come to know each other, and we both lived in the Riverdale section of the Bronx. So a friendship was formed, which still goes on to this day. And on that April day in 1973, when he became the game's first designated hitter on opening day in Boston, I went to the clubhouse after the game and I said, "Give me your bat. I want to send the bat to the Hall of Fame." So he gave me the bat. We sent it to Cooperstown where it was displayed. And I like to say it's the only bat in Cooperstown that commemorates a walk, because that's what he did his first at bat. He walked with the bases loaded and drove in a run.
Ron Blumberg later became a manager of the Israel team, baseball team in the World Baseball Classic competition. Tell us about your role in that and how you have seen the progress over the years. It didn't do too well this year, but the progress that this assemblage of players that played for Israel has made since the beginning of this competition.
It's a marvelous story. I think it sort of begins with a fellow in Boston named Martin Abramowitz, who created a set of baseball cards of all the Jewish players in history. And I think that got people thinking about the Jewish heritage for the game. And then in 2007, I was asked to do public relations for the Israel Baseball League, which would be the first professional baseball league in the Middle East. It went into the summer of '07 with 6 teams. The managers included Kenny Holtzman, Ron Blumberg, and Art Shamsky. Shamsky, also a close friend. I think I was the one who recommended him for the job. But in any case, they set up this league with 6 teams, and they played a full schedule of probably about 40 games each team. And I went there to do the public relations. It didn't succeed. I mean, we finished the season and we had a champion. Shamsky's team beat Bloomberg's team for the World Series of Israel. But we needed a year's head start, really, to grow the game there, to run clinics, to get people familiar with the sport. Because as it was, mostly the fans were Americans who happened to be living or visiting Israel. Not many Israelis decided, oh, let's take in a baseball game and see what this is all about. So while on opening day, we had several thousand people show up, as the season went on, it diminished to a couple of hundred, sometimes less. And clearly it was losing money. It really wasn't going to make it. We needed a year to develop it in thought for the Israel people. And we didn't have that luxury. There wasn't enough financing to do a whole year without any revenue coming in. So it didn't work, but now we see Israel in the World Baseball Classic. And I think the roots of that came from the Israel Baseball League, which they only have 3 fields, and one of them had a light pole in right field. So that complicated it a little bit. Baptist Village, if you're familiar with that area, provided the one really good field. I loved it. It was the only time I've ever been in Israel. I went to Jerusalem just as a sightseer, and it was a great experience for me. But I'm really sorry the league didn't do better.
Yeah, but I think you're right about the connection and the showing of the Israeli team, not this year, but in the last baseball classic, was really quite good. Yeah. They went through a couple of rounds, and I think that soccer and basketball, I think, will always be king or co-kings here. But baseball does have a greater amount of interest, and you're right. A lot of it is with Americans who've moved here or visiting here, but still, people are more aware of it. You talked about Ron Blumberg, Mickey Mantle. Who are some of the other players, favorite players of yours that you got to know quite well?
Oh gosh, sometimes people ask me who I didn't like, and I'm hard pressed to come up with any names at all. Baseball players tend to be very likable guys. They have a lot of self-confidence. because they've been told since they were in Little League that they're special, and they relate to that. And they're good with fans, and they were wonderful companions just as we traveled. I miss most of all the road trips. For years and years and years, I made every Yankee road trip and all of spring training. And that's where you really develop friendships, is on the road. You go to dinner, you go to lunch together. Um, I'm going on a Yankee cruise this coming December with some old friends. Bloomberg's going to be on the cruise, Mickey Rivers, um, Greg Nettles, Chris Chambliss. And I'm so looking forward to just 7 nights on a beautiful celebrity line cruise ship. I'll be running some panels and trivia contests and things like that. I'll be a tumbler. Is that the word?
Yeah, well, a tumbler. Yeah, that's an important job, is to get the conversation going.
Right. So
I want to touch briefly, though, on your friendship with Thurman Munson,
okay.
since you've written 2 books about him, one of which was an autobiography that you wrote with him. Tell us about your friendship with Munson and how his tragic death affected you and your connection to baseball. In however much you're comfortable in sharing it. It was such a shock that day. All of us who were baseball fans, Yankee fans, of course. Tell us about that connection that you had with him.
Well, he was the captain of the Yankees, and appropriately so. He had this quality about him that just spelled leadership. You were sort of drawn to his leadership. We were not close friends, but we got along fine. And I was the PR guy, and he was the captain of the team. So I needed to call on him often to perform captain duties off the field, like meet this group of advertisers with their kids before the game. And he was always grumpy about it because that was his personality, but he would do it. So we had this friendship going. And then after he won the MVP award in 1976, I went to him and I said, you don't talk to any sports writers. They're all not in favor with you. And somebody's probably going to write a book about you because you won an MVP award with the New York Yankees. So what would you think of doing an autobiography? I'll just listen to you, take notes, write the book, you read it and approve it, and we're off. So he said, I'm 29, I'm too young for an autobiography. And I said, well, not in baseball years. You're really at a high profile position in our national pastime. So we wound up doing the book, came out in 1978. And then in 1979, tragically, he died piloting his own aircraft in Canton, Ohio, his hometown. I still kind of choke up when I remember the day. And I remember the call from George Steinbrenner saying, Thurman's gone. Jeez. So we reissued the book. In fact, that autobiography is being reissued now. Another publisher decided enough time has elapsed and they're putting it out now. It's called Thurm. They changed the title from Thurman Munson to Thurm. But then in 2009, which was the 30th anniversary of his passing, I did a completely fresh biography, which of course included the details of the plane crash and the reaction of Yankee fans to this day. You go to any game today, there's a lot of people that wear Munson t-shirts.
Mm-hmm.
So for a star of that magnitude to die in the middle of the season is kind of an unprecedented thing to this day in baseball. And it was just a tragedy up and down. And the loyalty of his fans, who very much want him in the Baseball Hall of Fame, still remains strong.
Well, you were executive producer of the Yankees television broadcasts during the 1980s. I grew up listening on radio, if I could get the signal at night, to Yankee games. And it was Mel Allen, Red Barber, I think Jerry Coleman, I think actually was.
That was earlier.
No, that's very early. That's where I started. But into the 1980s, tell us about your experiences working with Phil Rizzuto, for example.
Oh, Phil was great. Now, as a kid, I listened to Phil Rizzuto. I'm a little too young to really remember him as a player, but he was a Hall of Fame shortstop. Then he became a broadcaster, And he went down so easy on the mind. He was just like everybody's favorite uncle telling you about the game. So then I became executive producer after my time as PR director. And it was like, I'm Phil Rizzuto's boss. Who would have seen this coming? And he was just a joy to work with. He would leave sometimes in the seventh inning to beat the traffic over the Washington Bridge, but you could forgive anything about Phil Rizzuto. He was you were bound by his heart forever to him. So I'll tell you a little Rizzuto story. He came up in 1941, so he really went back old school and everything. And occasionally, if a player would hit what we might call a cheap home run, like drop into the first row in the grandstand for a home run, he would call it a Chinese home run. And one day I got a call at my office from a Chinese woman. She identified herself as that. And she said, very politely, but she said, I don't like when he does that. It's insulting. It means inferior in some way. So I called Phil, not knowing where this would go and whether he would be receptive to rethinking himself on this. And instead, he was very PC about it right away. He said, oh, she's right. Of course she's right. I'll never do it again. And he never did. So a sweet little story about Phil, where you might have expected that he would say, that's just an expression. It's not meant to suggest inferiority. But of course it did. And good for him that he reacted to it.
Yeah, and I think his, as you describe it, his innate goodness. I mean, it came through, I think, in many ways, and in his demeanor on the air, and was, I think, one of those players, an early player who made the transition from the field into the broadcast booth, and did such a great job. Last question, Marty. We talked about the Brooklyn connection that you have. I want to talk about the Jewish connection to baseball. Now, I know basketball is considered the city game, and of course, there were many Jews in the early days of college basketball when it became in the 1940s, when it was starting to get big and get popular. And into the 1950s, there were Jewish players, but baseball always seemed to attract every man, not just the folks who could play the game, but every man. Why do you think that is? And I think it exists to this day. There's an excitement and a connection in our community, and I'm sure we're not the only ones, obviously, but I can feel it is palpable in our community that there is this connection to the national pastime. What do you say about that?
I find that culturally, there's so many things about baseball that appeal to Jewish fans, whether it's the statistics or the off the field stories or the strategy and now the analytics. It's always had a strong tie to Jewish fans, and I've always known that. There's 12 major league players currently who are Jewish, which doesn't sound like much, but it's a lot more than it used to be, and it accurately reflects the percentage of Jews in the United States. It probably wouldn't surprise you to know that none of the 12 have two Jewish parents. It's one, but that's modern life today in America. The connection has always been strong, and when I have done interviews that had some element of Judaism to it, the reaction has always been so strong. If it's a call-in radio show, a lot of Jewish people will call in. I'm not that strong culturally Jewish. With each passing generation, the tie gets a little less. But I still observant and have Passover Seder last week and things like that. My kids far less, and my parents and grandparents and great-grandparents far more. So it's diminished with each generation, but somehow baseball has always had a strong pull.
Well, we once had an exhibition at the B'nai B'rith Museum, which was in our previous location, and it was about Jews in sports. And we had on display a Hank Greenberg jersey and a Koufax jersey. And the director of the museum asked me, I wanted to take a picture in one of them. So I had to think, and given the Brooklyn roots of my family, of course, I went for Koufax, also because Koufax was of my generation. So I have that picture, but those are the two iconic figures when we look back, and it's good to know that there are 12 right now, and hopefully more into the future. Well, Pinstripes by the Tail, half a century in and around Yankees baseball by Marty Appel is available for pre-order online or wherever you purchase books. To find out more about Marty, Pinstripes by the Tail, and his other books, and his unrivaled insights on America's pastime, visit appelpr.com. We could be here all day talking about this, Marty. We really appreciate your being here. Wishing you much success with Pinstripes by the Tail. I think I speak for a lot of Yankee and baseball fans when I say I'm looking forward to getting lost in more of your stories. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to Marty Appel and to you for watching this conversation with B'nai B'rith. Now, if you enjoyed this interview, subscribe to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. And be sure to visit our website, b'naibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. For my guest, Marty Appel, I'm Dan Mariaschin. Join us again soon.